In my 6th year of nursing, I started keeping a second journal, not the clinical one, not the one my supervisor could read if she needed to, a personal one. Spiral-bound, dark green cover, bought at a drugstore on Burnside on the way to a night shift. The kind of notebook you use when you don't want to be precise, when you're tracking something you can't name yet. What I was tracking was this: the last 72 hours. Not medically, not in terms of vital signs or medication changes or the specific patterns of a body shutting down. I had all of that in the chart. What I was tracking in the green notebook was what patients said in those last 3 days. Not the confused things, not the requests for water or the calls for family members whose names they couldn't quite reach. The specific, particular things. The things that were so concrete they didn't fit inside any clinical framework I had been given. Almost every patient. Not some. Not a few outliers I could write off as unusual presentations. Almost every patient I watched approach death in those final 72 hours described seeing someone in the room who was not there. Not a vague shape, not a shadow, or a movement in the periphery. A person. A specific person with a name, often with specific clothing, often with specific words. And in almost every case, the person they described was dead. I wrote this down over and over in the green notebook for 4 years before I told anyone, because telling someone meant one of two things. Either I was seeing something real that had no clinical explanation, or I had been compromised in some way I didn't understand. Neither option felt safe to say out loud in an ICU break room in Portland, Oregon, in the early 2000s. So I wrote it down. And I kept working. And then, in my 18th year, I moved into the palliative care and hospice wing at Providence, Portland. And what had been a pattern I tracked quietly in the ICU became something I could no longer manage at arm's length. Frances was 73 years old, retired middle school history teacher from Grants Pass, Oregon. She'd been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer 14 months before I met her. By the time she arrived in the hospice unit, the disease had reached her peritoneal cavity and both lungs. There was nothing left to treat. We were there to make what remained as comfortable as it could be. Clinically, she was straightforward by day 9 of her admission. She was on a continuous subcutaneous infusion, 4 milligrams of morphine per hour through a pump she wore on her left side. Her GCS had been tracking downward since day 7. She was oriented to her name, sometimes, to place and date, not reliably. Standard end-stage presentation for someone in her position. What was not in the chart was what she started saying that morning. I was doing her 7 o'clock medication check. The hospice unit at that hour is a particular kind of quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of people being very careful with sound. Frances was lying on her left side, facing the window. The October light was coming in low and pale, the way it does in Portland in autumn. She turned her head and said clearly, not with the searching quality that comes with altered cognition, but clearly the way you state something obvious to someone who has simply missed it. She said, "Dorothy's back." I asked her who Dorothy was. She looked at me with an expression of mild, patient surprise, the expression of someone who has told you something once and is now telling you again without annoyance. She said, "My sister. She keeps coming back every morning. She was here last night too, but I didn't want to wake anyone." I made a note in the chart. Patient reports visual presence of deceased family member consistent with terminal perceptual changes. Standard documentation. I had written that sentence, or a version close enough to be identical, dozens of times. What I did not do, and this is the thing I have not made peace with, is ask Frances what Dorothy looked like. I had the information. She was offering it, and I moved on to the next room. It was the following morning that she told me anyway. Same hour, same low light through the same window. Frances was looking toward the corner near the radiator. Not at the wall, past it somehow at a specific point in the middle distance that had her full attention. She said, "She's wearing the earrings from the New Mexico trip, the turquoise ones from that little market on Canyon Road. She looks so young, she doesn't look like the last time I saw her." Canyon Road, a turquoise market, Santa Fe. I wrote it in the green notebook, not in the chart. In the green notebook where I kept the things I didn't have a clinical box for. Frances died on day 11, just before 4 in the morning. She was alone, which was not what anyone had planned. Her daughter had been there until midnight and gone home to sleep. But sometimes the body decides its own timing, and there is nothing that changes that. The night aide checked on her at 3:40. By 3:58, she was gone. Her morphine drip was still running. Her GCS, the last time it was formally assessed, had been a 4. A 4. On a scale where 15 means you are fully oriented and 3 means you are not generating any meaningful response. And she had told me about Canyon Road. 4 days after Frances died, I called her family. Her daughter Margot answered on the second ring, the careful answering of someone who had been expecting calls they weren't sure they wanted. I told her I had been one of Frances's nurses. I said I wanted to ask about something Frances had described, if that was all right. There was a pause. Margot said, "Yes." I asked, "Did Frances have a sister named Dorothy?" She said, "Yes. Dorothy died in 1982, a car accident. She was 34 years old." I asked, "Did Frances and Dorothy ever take a trip together to New Mexico?" A longer pause this time. She said, "They went to Santa Fe in, God, it must have been 1974. I was 7. I remember because they came back with earrings for my mother, turquoise, from some market they found. Mum wore them to everything for years." I said, "Was the market on Canyon Road?" Margot didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "How would you know that?" I said, "Frances told me." Another silence. Then, "She hadn't mentioned Dorothy to me in years. I don't think she talked about her to anyone. It was too hard." Frances had been in the hospice unit for 11 days. Her intake paperwork listed no surviving siblings. Dorothy's name had not come up in any of the intake interviews, any of the family meetings, any of the social work notes. The turquoise earrings from a specific outdoor market on a specific street in Santa Fe, from a trip that had taken place in 1974, 50 years before Frances entered our care, existed nowhere in any document that any member of our team had access to. They were in the green notebook. Because Frances had described them on the morning of day 10, and Frances had been on 4 milligrams of morphine an hour, non-oriented to date and place with a GCS that would not have qualified her to sign a consent form. I closed the notebook after I hung up the phone, and I sat with what I had been doing, what I had not been doing, for 18 years. I want to tell you what the research actually says about this, because it is not fringe. It is not anecdotal, and it is not small. Dr. Christopher Kerr is a physician and researcher who serves as Chief Medical Officer at Hospice Buffalo in New York. He holds both an MD and a PhD. His team spent more than a decade doing something that seems obvious only in retrospect. They asked. They visited dying patients daily and asked directly whether they were experiencing any unusual visions or dreams, not waiting for patients to bring it up, not flagging it in the chart, just asking. Out of more than 1,400 patients, 88% reported at least one end-of-life dream or vision. The most common element in those experiences, a deceased relative, specific, named, described with physical characteristics. What they were wearing, how they looked, whether they communicated. His team published their findings in the Journal of Palliative Medicine. His TEDx talk on the subject has been viewed nearly 3 million times. This is not new territory. In 1977, Carlis Osis and Erlendur Haraldsson, Two researchers with the American Society for Psychical Research published a landmark study based on 10,000 questionnaires sent to physicians and nurses across the United States and India. They were looking for deathbed visions across two completely different cultural contexts. In both the American surveys and the Indian surveys, 77 to 83% of the visions reported were of deceased loved ones. The experience across cultures was almost universally described as comforting, not frightening, not disorienting, comforting. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross documented this same pattern extensively across 5 decades of work with dying patients. She wrote about it in her early clinical work in the 1960s, before it was something anyone would study formally, before the term near-death experience existed in the popular vocabulary. She struggled with how to describe what she was seeing because her training gave her no container for it. She wrote it down anyway. Here is what I can say as a nurse about terminal delirium. It is real. It happens. It is caused by organ dysfunction, hypoxia, the metabolic disruption that comes with the body shutting down, the effects of opioids on a system that is no longer processing them efficiently. It produces confusion, sometimes agitation, sometimes paranoia, sometimes fragmented visual experiences that have no coherent content and do not comfort the person having them. Here is what Francis described: a deceased sister, named, a specific trip, a specific city, a specific market, on a specific street, a specific pair of earrings. I have tried to put those two things in the same box, terminal delirium and Canyon Road. I have tried for years. The box does not close. What I am ashamed of is not that I didn't recognize it when I saw it. I was trained not to. The clinical frameworks I worked inside were built on a single interpretation. This is what dying brains do under hypoxic and pharmacological stress. Document the symptom. Manage the distress. Move on. What I am ashamed of is that I never asked. For 18 years in the ICU and then 4 more years in the hospice unit, I wrote patient reports presence of perceived figure, consistent with terminal perceptual changes, and moved to the next chart. I documented the symptom. I never documented the content. I never asked who the person was. I never called the families afterward to follow up. After my surgery in 2019, after what happened to me during the 3 minutes and change in the operating room at Providence, Portland, that I have talked about in pieces on this channel, I went back through the green notebook, every entry, going back to my 6th year, dozens of cases, every one a specific person described in specific terms in the last days of life. In none of them had I followed up. In none of them had I asked for a verifiable detail. I changed my practice after that. When the moment is right, and I read the room because these are people in their last days and precision is not always the thing they need, I ask, who is the person? What are they wearing? What do they look like? And then I follow up with the families when they are willing. In the 7 cases where I was able to complete a full follow-up, 5 returned descriptions that were confirmed. Not confirmed in a general sense, confirmed with specifics that were not present anywhere in the patient's records. A childhood nickname used only within the family. A physical characteristic the patient couldn't have observed from any photograph in the room. In one case, an address from 40 years before the patient's admission that the family had to look up to verify. 5 out of 7. I am still counting. I am still asking. I am still writing things down in a notebook that has no clinical category. Here is what I want to say to you. If you are sitting with someone who is dying, when they turn toward the window and say a name, ask them what the person is wearing. Ask how old they look. Ask what they're doing. Write it down, not because you'll be able to explain it. I cannot explain Francis. I have tried from every angle I know. I have read Kerr and Osis and Haraldson and Kubler-Ross and the studies in between, and I can describe the phenomenon in the aggregate, 88% deceased relatives, specific and comforting, but I cannot explain the earrings from Canyon Road, 1974. What I can tell you is that what the dying describe in those final hours is not random noise. It is not the static of a system shutting down. It is specific. It is named. It is often, when you follow up, verifiable in ways that have no clinical explanation I have been trained to give. I spent 18 years deciding it wasn't worth asking. The next time someone you love is leaving, and they say someone's name you don't recognize, ask them to describe who they see. You might not get an answer you can explain, but you might get an answer that means something you didn't know you needed to hear.